Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this coffee break with CLF. My name is Tommaso Wagner. I'm going to be your host today, and I'm really excited to welcome you to this special program on climate science and solutions. Today, we're going to explore the science behind climate change and weather in New England, and what we need to do to prepare our communities for rising seas, stronger nor'easters, and higher temperatures. Climate change is one of the most pressing issues of our time, and there's so many questions that we need answered. Its impacts will be felt around the world. And here in New England, we will not be immune. In fact, we're already starting to see many of these impacts today. So joining us this morning to discuss how climate change is affecting New England's weather and what we need to do to prepare for these impacts are Deanna Moran, the Director of Environmental Planning at CLF. Deanna manages CLF's work on climate resilience, and she's responsible for identifying and implementing cutting-edge solutions to a variety of environmental problems at the intersection of planning, development, and regulation. We also have with us today Mathew Barlow, Professor of Climate Science at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. Dr. Barlow's research is on the influence of large-scale climate variability and change on local conditions of importance to society. He particularly focuses on drought in different regions of the world, especially in the Middle East and Southwest Asia. And he also focuses on extreme precipitation and temperature events in the northeastern US. Of course, while we're discussing today how to prepare for climate impacts, CLF is also pushing to address the root causes of climate change, such as cutting carbon emissions and building a clean energy future. You can learn about that part of our work by visiting www.clf.org. Now, before we get started, I just wanted to make a housekeeping note. If you're having any technical difficulties, Katie Ardrey, our events manager, is standing by to help. So please reach out to her via email at kardrey@clf.org. We also wanted to say that we're really excited to take your questions, and we'll be fielding those in a little bit. So for those viewing on our website, please submit questions through the chat box. The chat box features will be at the right of this video. And for our Facebook viewers, please submit your questions as comments right below the live stream. So without any further ado, we'd like to turn over to our first segment, which is a conversation between our two guests, CLF's Deanna Moran and Professor Matt Barlow of UMass Lowell.
Great. Good morning, everyone. I'm Deanna Moran. I'm the Director of Environmental Planning at Conservation Law Foundation. I want to thank Dr. Barlow of UMass Lowell for joining us today. Welcome, Dr. Barlow.
Good morning, and thank you very much, Deanna, for having me.
So let's start off. Can you tell us a little bit about the climate impacts that we can expect to see in New England and how that's going to impact people's everyday lives, the weather conditions, all that?
Sure. And just for a bit of context, I wanted to just start by saying that we usually talk about global warming levels. There's been a lot of discussion of 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius, 3 degrees Celsius or more. I just wanted to point out that those global numbers sound small, but really mean big changes locally. And just for one small piece of context, the temperature during the last ice age, when we had close to a mile of ice over us right now, the temperature difference between then and now was only about 4.5 degrees Celsius globally. So those global numbers, which sound small, most of us wouldn't notice a temperature difference of a degree or more on any day. That's the global number, but locally they correspond to much bigger differences, like we've been seeing over the last couple of days. So one point I want to make is that locally, with global warming, we're going to see a lot more days like we're seeing today in the last couple of days over 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And I think we have a figure that shows the increasing heat wave days, increase in hot days. So they're going to go up regardless of the decisions we make, but they might go up a fair amount, or they might go up a lot. So one of the things that we expect to see locally is an increase in these number of hot days over 90 degrees Fahrenheit. if we take rapid, dramatic action in terms of reducing emissions, we hope to hold that number to doubling, so twice as many as we see now. That's sort of the best case scenario. The worst case scenario with very high emissions would be by the end of the century, almost every day in summer could be like today. So that's one of the climate impacts we can see in New England, and the choices that we make now will have a lot of influence on which of those paths we go down. But I also want to emphasize that it's not just temperature. It's a little hard for me to think of things other than temperature on a day like today, but also increases in flooding, increases in storm damage, sea level rise along the coast, and also ocean acidification for coastal states like in New England. There will be a lot of changes to the ocean as well. So there are a range of impacts, not just temperature, but also several other things. And the last point I would want to make about local impacts is that there are the local impacts we experience directly with weather and climate, but also we'll have local impacts from temperature changes on the other side of the world, where much of our food is grown, and also regionally over the US, in terms of insurance costs, people moving because the climate no longer sustains them. So global changes and national changes will affect us locally, even in the cases where it's not affecting our weather.
Great, thank you. And obviously, as Tommaso mentioned in his introduction, we're simultaneously working to reduce emissions through mitigation efforts while we're simultaneously trying to adapt to climate impacts. Can you talk a little bit about why both of these efforts are important and how they intersect?
Yeah, so we're already on a path to some impacts, some substantial impacts, and we're already seeing substantial impacts. We're already seeing an increase in high temperature events. We're already seeing an increase in flooding. We're already seeing changes to the ocean. So we're already seeing changes. We will see changes in the future. We know that's going to happen. So we absolutely have to focus some of our attention on adaptation, on making our society more resilient and our infrastructure more resilient to those changes. But mitigation, reducing our emissions, is extremely important as well, because the more that we mitigate now, the less we have to adapt to in the future. And in general, it's much cheaper to mitigate now than to adapt later, both in terms of money, in terms of economic impact, but also in terms of societal impact, and in many cases, saving lives. It's much more effective to mitigate now. So we really need to do both.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, we hear a lot about how efforts to adapt to changing climate conditions can also be an opportunity to address other issues, longstanding problems in society. Can you talk a little bit about, how can our efforts to adapt to climate change actually help us to solve other issues?
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think one of the most important points about addressing climate change is that, as you say, we can address many other important problems as well, and it will come carefully planned solutions will come with a lot of benefits. Addressing climate change is very much a benefit on its own, but if we think about what we're doing carefully, all of our actions can have public health benefits. They can reduce inequality. We can have a healthier ecosystem and environment. So for instance, if we're trying to reduce flooding, we can increase green space, which will reduce the effects of flooding, but will also provide recreation opportunities for people and provide a healthier environment. If we reduce emissions, we reduce air pollution, which has pretty dramatic positive health impacts. If you look at where climate impacts, both in our area and worldwide, are likely to be the worst, They're primarily in lower income neighborhoods and in communities of color. So if we address those impacts through better building, then we can also address some important social inequalities. And this is also sometimes called co-solving or multi-solving. But yeah, it's this important idea that we know we need to make these changes to address climate change. So if we think about how we do them thoughtfully, they can have lots of other very positive effects, both in the short term and in the long term.
Great. So how do you think New England is doing? Obviously, you're based in Massachusetts, so maybe Massachusetts specifically, but how are we doing in terms of addressing climate risk?
So I think we have a fair amount of activity. Attention has been paid over the last several years on this in Massachusetts specifically, and to some degree in New England more broadly. So there's a lot of planning going on. There's a lot of discussion. There's new legislation. There's a lot of planning by individual municipalities. So I think there's a lot of good discussion. There's also a lot of good goals in terms of, especially Massachusetts now has a goal of net zero emissions, I think by 2050, meaning that we would be emitting no more carbon than we remove in various ways. So those are great goals. There's lots of great discussions. I think the key thing over the next, say, 5 to 10 years is specifics. So we have great goals. How are we going to get there? And I think that we will need big changes in transportation, big changes in our built infrastructure, big changes along the coast. So I think we need to start changing our discussion into one that produces specifics, and then to actually look at how we're going to get those things done and done quickly if we want to rule out the bigger changes.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree with that more. Can you talk a little bit about the urgency of these efforts? What's the time frame that we're looking at to respond to impacts that we know we can't avoid? Those ones that we're really kind of locked into, no matter how much we were able to reduce emissions, we're not going to be able to avoid them. What do we have to do? How urgent are efforts to adapt to those impacts?
Yeah, so I just want to talk about this in two different ways, so which seem kind of contradictory but aren't. On the one hand, this is a very urgent problem, and we need to be acting now, this year, next year, over the next decade. So on the one hand, it is very urgent. On the other hand, you sometimes hear people say that we're already doomed, or that society is going to collapse, or if we don't do one thing or another within 5 or 10 years, then all hope is lost. So I want to emphasize that this is a very urgent problem. Decisions we make over the next 5 to 10 years will have large implications for the next 30, 50, 70 years. So it's extremely urgent, but we're not doomed. Hope is not lost. If we don't do something next year, it's better to do that the year after that than to not do it at all. So we need to make progress, but I don't want people to walk away with the feeling that if we don't do something in the next year, then all hope is lost, or that we're doomed. It is an urgent problem, but no matter when we act, it will be better to act than to not do anything. So that said, I mean, I think when we have heat waves like we're seeing now, we're already seeing the influence of climate change. Even with dramatic reductions, the frequency of these heat waves in our area is likely to double in the next 30 or 40 years. So that's if we act urgently. If we don't act urgently, this could be what our summers are like not that long from now. So I think that's the kind of scale of urgency here, is that even if we act very rapidly, we're still going to see pretty dramatic changes. But going back to your earlier point, the changes that we need to make so urgently can have lots of positive benefits. We don't have to give up all technology and go and live in a field or anything like that. We can make things more efficient. That will save us money. There are lots of actions we can take that will create jobs, good paying jobs. There are lots of actions we can take that will reduce societal inequality. So it is urgent. We do need to act, but there are lots of positive things that can come from those actions.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think it can be really daunting for people to think about the challenges, and when you talk about the time frame and the urgency of needing to address them, it can be hard to feel like there's hope or there's an opportunity to act. So, on that note, can you talk a little bit about what are the positive things on the horizon? What are you optimistic about?
Yeah, I have colleagues who talk sometimes about choosing to be optimistic, and that's my perspective on this. And there are lots of things that we've done societally, lots of great positive changes over the last century, and even over the last couple of decades. And it's a lot of those choices that we've made, positive choices, that give me a lot of optimism that we can fix this. So, for instance, child mortality over the last century has been dramatically reduced. Access to education has been dramatically increased. We've wiped out polio almost entirely. We've wiped out major diseases. So we've shown that as a global society and as a national society, we can make these vast positive changes. That gives me a lot of hope. Nationally, we've had the Clean Air and Clean Water Act. And I think that's a dramatic change, maybe to those of us who are a little older can remember when Boston Harbor was one of the dirtiest harbors in the entire nation, and now has whales and seals and harbor porpoises in it. So our air is much cleaner. So we've had very successful legislation. We've had very successful court cases that have pushed us in a very positive direction. We've had global agreements to reduce the pollutants that cause the ozone hole. That was a major international agreement that's been tremendously successful. So we've shown globally, nationally, locally, that we can make big positive changes if we choose to. We also have the tools to address global warming. We've made tremendous progress in terms of alternative energy. We know lots of things about public transportation and building infrastructure. So we have the tools. We've shown that we can make these big changes. And now we're starting to talk about choosing to make these changes. So we have the tools. We've shown that we've kind of done this thing, and I think now we're having this discussion about actually doing it. The U.S. has recently re-entered global discussions on the Paris Climate Accord, these international agreements on how to reduce emissions. There's a lot of global attention. There have been some recent successful court cases nationally and internationally. So I think that we've shown that we can do the kind of thing we need to do. We have the tools to do it, and now I think we're having the discussion about actually doing it. One thing that does come up sometimes is uncertainty. Do we really know enough to act? And I just want to emphasize that the basic aspects, the basic science of climate change is more than 100 years old. We're talking about very basic science here. We're already seeing the impacts that were predicted by climate models in the 80s and 90s. So we've already successfully predicted a lot of what's happened. So we have a great deal of confidence in the basic aspects of what will happen if we take urgent action and if we don't. So there's always uncertainty in life. We don't know all the details, but we know plenty to know that we need to act urgently. So, to circle back to the positive, the positive aspect is that, yes, I am optimistic. This is the type of problem we've shown we can solve. We have the tools to solve it. And we think we can really improve things along the way as we work on it.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Barlow, for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to Deanna, Moran, and Professor Barlow both. That was a really elucidating conversation, and it was a real privilege to be able to listen in. Next, I'll be spending just a few minutes talking with Deanna about some of the ways that we can prepare our communities for impacts of some of those changing, of some of the climate change that Professor Barlow was discussing. Before we get into that, though, I just want to remind everyone that we will be taking questions for both Professor Barlow and for Deanna. So you can add your questions in the chat box to the right of the video if you're watching on the website, and you can submit your questions as comments below the live stream if you're on Facebook. Deanna, thank you again for joining us today. I'd like to start with some of the basics. Could you talk to us about what's happening across the region when it comes to adapting to the impacts of climate change on communities?
Yeah, absolutely. And I like that this question is framed from a regional perspective because I think that New England is really well positioned to lead on climate resilience. As a region, we're facing the whole gamut of climate change impacts, from flooding, both inland and coastal, to heat, to extreme precipitation. In a lot of New England states, particularly, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Vermont, are really already leading the way when it comes to climate planning and adaptation. So, climate resilience is kind of a unique problem. It really necessitates climate planning and action at all levels of government. So national, regional, state, local. Climate impacts, don't respect state or municipal boundaries. So just because we're planning for it in one city or town or state doesn't mean that, those effects don't spill over into other areas. So taking a regional approach, I think, is really key. And although we've, seen a lot of state and local planning in New England, I think we have seen less of a regional approach so far. I think that that's, definitely something that we should be striving for over the next few years. And planning at different levels, it layers on top of each other. So when we really saw the federal government exit from this space during the Trump administration, states and cities in New England really stepped up to fill that gap. And those were essential efforts over the last few years that really helped to move the ball forward while the federal government, was standing by. Now, under the Biden administration, we're starting to see some of those Obama era rules reinstated. We're starting to see more movement on climate resilience through infrastructure and standards and elsewhere. And that's going to be really helpful, but it's still not enough. So now I think moving into this next phase, it's great to have some support from the federal government, especially funding. But all of those state and local efforts need to continue to progress. And as Dr. Barlow said in his remarks, we need to start really moving the ball from planning to action, away from the goals and towards implementation. And that's, I think, where we've stalled a little bit. I'm hoping that with the support of the federal government, hopefully funding support, we'll be able to make progress on that over the next 4 years. But a regional approach to impacts is going to be really, necessary. And I don't think we're quite there yet. So I think we need to figure out a way to plan and implement on our goals at a regional level and not just at the state and local level.
That makes a lot of sense, Deanna, and the regional approach is really important. You did talk in your answer also about some of these more state and local approaches, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about some of the legislation that's under construction aimed at helping communities prepare for climate change. What will this legislation do?
Yeah, absolutely. So, there's some efforts happening in various of the New England states. As I mentioned, some of the states are really leading on different areas. In Massachusetts, we have two bills in the state legislature this session, one in the House and one in the Senate, introduced by State Representative Sarah Peake and State Senator Nick Collins, respectively. In this legislation, one, I want to highlight that I really think that even though this legislation has been filed in Massachusetts, it's really applicable New England wide. So if we're successful in really getting this legislation across the finish line here, I think that it could be a model for some of the other New England states. But what the bill would do if it passed, and it's really focused on creating a framework for climate adaptation in this state, creating some concrete standards and parameters, particularly for our built infrastructure. And it would do a number of things. One, it would create some consistency and predictability in climate planning. And that, affects state licensing and permitting, financing, capital projects. It really just kind of sets the bar for here's the data we should be using. Here's, how you should be analyzing the data, just so everyone's kind of, working off of the same level. It also requires investor-owned utility companies like National Grid and Eversource to proactively plan for climate risks to their facilities and assets. So that's not something that right now is required at the federal level. There are very few, if any, states that have any type of kind of scaffolding in place for utility companies to take these things into consideration and to plan for them. There is, a certain level of this type of planning happening kind of voluntarily within those companies, but it's really inconsistent and just it's not enough. So this would really create kind of the parameters for what's being required of those companies. It also requires an evaluation of the effectiveness of the state's building code. So here in Massachusetts and in pretty much every other state in the country, our building codes do not take into consideration climate risk. And when you really dive into what building codes require and how they take into consideration historic patterns of weather, things like snow loads, precipitation, flooding, that data is really critical for establishing the codes and standards that keep our buildings safe. So it's really essential that we start to build climate risk into those. And then finally, the bill really helps to ensure that there is analysis of an adaptation to climate risks that don't disproportionately harm or burden our most vulnerable communities, low income, populations of color, who, as Matt mentioned earlier, are already kind of disproportionately burdened by climate impacts.
Wow, Deanna, this bill seems like it's really far-reaching, and I was hoping we could dig into some of the individual things that some of these bills do, because the legislation itself seems pretty effective. And so I was wondering, I know that CLF is also working on proposals to update building codes. Why is updating these codes so important, and what do you hope to see?
Yeah, building codes is a really critical area that we're working in, that we are pushing others to work in. As I mentioned, these codes and standards are directly, inextricably tied to the safety of buildings and therefore the safety of residents. And buildings being built today are going to be around for at least 50 years. When you think back to some of the graphs that Dr. Barlow showed during his remarks, we're going to be facing a completely different climate here in New England. And we're just not prepared for that. And our buildings are not prepared for that. There's a certain amount of retrofitting that we're going to need to do for our existing building stock. But at the very least, we haven't tackled that yet, but at the very least, we should be planning ahead for buildings that are built today. And there's a couple of really, low-hanging fruit things that we can do pretty immediately that will have a huge impact. I mean, one of the biggest things that CLF has been pushing for is to sever the tie between state building codes and FEMA flood maps. FEMA flood maps are unfortunately kind of baked into state and local land use planning at a number of different levels, building codes included. And they're not sufficient for our needs. We know that they're inaccurate, not just because they don't incorporate climate change, but because they themselves are based on old data. They're not dynamic. They don't take into consideration, really important factors like erosion and other things that can impact the extent of the floodplain. And most importantly, they don't consider climate change. So we know that the extent of the FEMA floodplain is not truly the area that is at risk of flooding. And we've seen the impacts of that time and time again with, huge hurricanes, extreme weather, and who's impacted. I mean, during Hurricane Harvey, the majority of claims that were filed after Hurricane Harvey were outside of the quote unquote 100-year floodplain. And in Massachusetts and in many of the other states, Rhode Island, we have a good idea of what the future floodplain is going to look like. We have maps that show us what we believe the extent will be in 2070 and 2100. So we have that data available. We should use it. And what we're really pushing for is for cities and towns to at least have the option to use it. This is not true in every New England state, but in Massachusetts, cities and towns are preempted by the state building code. So they can't pass local codes that conflict with the state building code, even if they're more stringent, even if they're more protective. And so in a city, like Boston or Cambridge, they've got these great maps and they can't require flood resistant construction outside of the FEMA designated floodplain. And that's a problem. They should be able to do that. They shouldn't have to negotiate that or find, a loophole on how to do that without preempting the state building code. It should be something that they are allowed to do if they want to, and eventually something that they're mandated to do. So that's kind of one piece that, that's an easy fix, we think, something that we could change overnight and would make a huge difference. And obviously, this is different depending on where you are in New England. Not every state cities and towns are not preempted by the state building code. I know that's true in Massachusetts. I think that's true in Rhode Island. But across the country and across this region, we need to start thinking about how we are, comprehensively and strategically addressing climate risks in our built infrastructure. Buildings is one piece of that. There's obviously much more of our infrastructure that we also need to take that into consideration for. But states are really, in regions like New England, are really in a good position to lead on incorporating that into codes.
Yeah, there seems to be very far-reaching impacts on lots of infrastructure all over the country, and especially in New England. I was hoping we could also talk a little bit about some of the utilities in New England. I know you mentioned that briefly earlier, but are these utilities prepared? Is this a type of infrastructure that's prepared for the impacts of climate change here?
Yeah, so I mean, we all saw what happened in Texas this past February. Millions of people there suffered in freezing weather without heat, power, water for days because utility companies failed to prepare for inevitable weather extremes. Not to say that the exact scenario that played out in Texas would play out in our region, but we're, as Dr. Barlow mentioned, we're not prepared for extreme heat. And heat, flooding, all of those different changing conditions have a significant impact on all of our infrastructure, including our utility infrastructure. And no, I do not think that we are prepared for that. I do not think that utility companies are doing enough to assess their vulnerabilities, to address those vulnerabilities. And just evidence of that, for example, in Massachusetts, many of our investor-owned utility companies come before the Department of Public Utilities, which is the agency that regulates them, for storm cost recovery every single year. And National Grid just filed a storm cost recovery docket, I think back in March, and they were looking to recover upwards of $50 million just for storm damage in 2019 alone. So those are the types of numbers that we're looking at, and all of that falls on the ratepayer. That storm recovery cost. So we're not doing enough. They need to be more proactive. Ratepayers deserve for them to be more proactive. And there will, inevitably be some upfront cost to assessing those vulnerabilities and adapting. But it's going to be a much better investment to make that capital and, to address that capital cost upfront than to continue to repair and rebuild after each storm every single year and passing those costs on to ratepayers. So, while our utilities may be more prepared for things like ice storms than Texas, sea level rise, more intense winter storms, hurricanes, heat waves in New England, we're not prepared for that. And these threats have not been adequately analyzed. The states are in a good position to put pressure on investor-owned utility companies to start looking at and preparing for these risks. And, they need to step up and start requiring that.
That makes a lot of sense, Deanna. And I know that also in your discussion about legislation, you talked about equity, and I was hoping we could talk just a little bit more about that. How are environmental justice communities, and especially low-income people and people of color, how are these folks disproportionately impacted by climate risks, and what can we do to address this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Dr. Barlow talked about this a little bit. Low income communities, communities of color, historically marginalized communities are disproportionately burdened by climate impacts, whether it's heat, and that, there are roots in that back to the, days of redlining, kind of historic ramifications of discrimination in US policy that have led to areas with less tree canopy coverage, less green space, which translates into more extreme heat, urban heat island effect. These communities of color and low-income communities are more likely to live in floodplains, and we're starting to see the impacts of that, not just in the increased risk of flooding and damage to property, but also increasing flood insurance premiums that are, people are having to relocate. So people are being displaced by the increasing risk and how it's affecting them through flood insurance premiums. So really across the board, also I think, climate changes are exacerbating some of the existing inequities that have existed for a long time that we failed to address. And this is not exactly on point, but I think we saw during the pandemic, these communities were also disproportionately affected by the pandemic. And part of that was because of the disproportionate health outcomes and higher rates of asthma and things that exacerbated the illness for them. And all of those things are, tied back to environmental injustices. So all of that is going to kind of be at the foundation of their risk when it comes to climate change and make them disproportionately exposed to the impacts of climate change. And just as an example, CLF did an analysis in partnership with one of our community partners, Communities Responding to Extreme Weather, or CREW, that showed that in Boston, Roxbury, and East Boston, there's extreme vulnerability because of high temperatures and increased flooding, and that was much higher in those neighborhoods and in other neighborhoods in Boston. So, our work has to first identify what those risks are to those marginalized communities all across New England, and then prioritize ways to ease the burden on them as we start to plan for climate adaptation. And in particular, making sure that climate adaptation efforts don't exacerbate the risks that they face. And that's possible too. I mean, you're seeing across the country people coming up with different screens, whether it's an environmental justice screen on a seawall or some other type of adaptation measure to make sure that whoever that's going to benefit, that's benefiting not everyone equally, but primarily benefiting these communities who are going to face the brunt of the impacts. And that's an interesting approach that I think we haven't taken before, which is we need to oversample. We need to make sure that this isn't a serving everybody equally type of approach. It's actually identifying the people who are going to be at the most risk, who are going to face the biggest burden, and prioritize easing their burden, and making sure that whatever efforts we take to address climate change doesn't exacerbate it.
Thanks so much, Shanna. That's so important to think about, and I'm glad that's at the forefront of our discussion here. Before we move on to questions, I would like to ask one last question, Deanna. What should our viewers today do to help move these efforts forward? These all seem really important.
Yeah, I think that there's a number of things that viewers can do, across New England, especially in some of the states I mentioned that are kind of actively reviewing some of these proposals for change. One thing is always to be in touch with your state representative. Call your state representative, your state senator, let them know that, there are many climate bills in the legislature this session. You want to see them voting on them. You want to see their support for those bills. As ratepayers, you can call on your utility company to do more when it comes to climate adaptation. You're the one funding every time their infrastructure is destroyed. You're the one suffering every time your power goes out because they were unprepared. So can definitely call on them in that way. And then at the local level, just holding your local electeds, your city or town staff accountable, making sure that we're moving beyond just climate adaptation planning and really towards implementation and action. And whether that means new building codes, zoning codes, really just pushing for those changes, which are going to have impacts in how we plan and settle in our communities. But it's going to be far less costly to address those impacts now proactively than it will be later if we have to respond, rebuild, relocate.
Thanks so much, Deanna. I'd like to take a little bit of time now to take some questions from our viewers for both Professor Barlow and for Deanna. So our first question today is, does the extreme weather we are currently seeing in the region, the current heat wave, yet Memorial Day not even breaking 50 degrees, does that have any connection to climate change? And I think this makes a lot of sense to first direct to Professor Barlow, but Deanna, if you'd like to weigh in, please do.
Sure, thanks. Great to start with an easy question. So the type of hot weather we're seeing is definitely related to climate change. Heat waves occur without climate change. They're a natural part of New England's weather to occasionally have heat waves, but to have them as frequently as we're now seeing them and as hot as we're now seeing them is definitely linked to climate change. So climate change is definitely stacking the deck here. The relationship to the very cold weather, we also expect an increase and have been seeing an increase in variability, what sometimes we call weather whiplash. It's, relatively cool and then very hot, or relatively dry and then very wet. We expect to see that kind of variability increase. Cold extremes are definitely decreasing overall. Whether we might, under some circumstances like this winter, see an occasional uptick in cold extremes, that's a matter of debate. But the increase in variability and the increase in heat waves is absolutely linked to climate change. And I would certainly encourage people, when they hear discussions of global numbers, these heat waves that we're seeing now, that's 1 degree of warming. So when you think about 2 degrees of warming, we're talking about really big changes. 2 degrees globally, 1 degree globally, this is how it plays out locally.
Thank you for your response there, Professor Barlow. And now we'll look for some other questions. So again, I think we'll direct this one to Professor Barlow first, but Deanna, if you'd like to weigh in, we'd love to hear from you. How at risk is Logan Airport?
Yeah, I expect Deanna might know more about the details of that. But in short, it's certainly at risk both to sea level rise, because Logan Airport is right on the water, as well as the combination of sea level rise with big storms in the winter and increasing high wind events.
Yeah, just to echo what Dr. Barlow said, I mentioned earlier, East Boston as a neighborhood is extremely vulnerable to flooding, obviously to heat, and Logan Airport's no exception. I think we've been hearing a lot of kind of anecdotal evidence too. Airports in particular have kind of their own unique challenges. I know there have been a couple of articles recently about the durability of kind of the asphalt on the runways and holding up to extreme heat when you've got temperatures, over 100 degrees consistently for a number of days. actual melting of the asphalt, and how that impacts the operations of an airport. So they're definitely at risk in the same ways that the rest of the neighborhood are. But I think they probably also have their own unique challenges that they're hopefully planning for, that I think that they will face over the next decade or more. And yeah, they're no exception. East Boston as a neighborhood is extremely vulnerable.
Well, it's good to know about that. And we'll now look for our next question. So, is global warming affecting the jet stream? What do you think, Professor Barlow?
Now we're getting into harder questions. So global warming is definitely affecting the jet stream, but in a somewhat complicated way. And exactly how the details are likely to play out is a source of considerable discussion in the climate community. There are general shifts of both the southern hemisphere and the northern hemisphere jet streams poleward, but there are a lot of regional details and complexities. So it is changing, but not in a very simple way. One thing that's gotten a lot of attention recently and has come up this past winter is whether the jet stream is getting more wavy and resulting in slower, stronger storms, more outbreaks of cold air. That's a possibility, but that's an area. There are lots of areas of agreement in climate science and climate change, and there are lots of areas that are still kind of under discussion, and that piece of jet stream change, whether it's getting wavier, that is still sort of under discussion, I would say.
Well, thank you very much for sharing that. Our next question is it possible to meaningfully address climate change if we continue to think humans are not part of nature and can use nature for our benefit? I'll give this question to both of you, but maybe you can go first this time, Deanna.
Well, it's a very philosophical question. I think the obvious answer would be no. As is kind of alluded to in the question, we have just extracted, what we require from the environment without any thought to how that kind of plays into the larger dynamics of us living on the environment. So I think the answer is no. I'm not quite sure how that translates into different approaches or different policies. I mean, we've been talking a lot about trying to use nature-based solutions, leverage kind of the natural capacity, systems capacity of nature to address some of the impacts that we're seeing, whether it's through green space, wetlands restoration. A lot of that has to do with restoring what we've damaged. So that's, one approach. But I think, from philosophically, I think, yes, that's probably the right approach. And I think that that's manifesting right now through kind of this renewed interest in how we can leverage the natural systems capacity of nature to address some of the impacts that we're seeing.
I would say that regardless of how you philosophically think about our relationship to nature, humans are going to be impacted strongly by climate change and its impacts on our environment, sort of regardless of your philosophical underpinnings to it. So whether you see it that way or not, we need to act either way. But that would probably be my philosophical interpretation as well.
Great. And so for our next question, this one's directed at Professor Barlow. What other areas of science do you see as critical for helping people understand and act to stem climate change?
Well, that's a great question, and I don't know that I have an immediate response to it. In terms of actually understanding the climate science, physics and math, especially statistics, are really central. I would say, looking at survey data for Massachusetts and the US as a whole, I think people understand the climate change science fairly well, at least a majority of people. Um, although I think people don't realize how many of their neighbors are in agreement. So I'm not sure that the science piece of it is the most critical piece. I would say the action, the political, the legislative, um, is where we need to move next. But if you're interested from a science perspective, it's probably physics and biology for the environmental impacts.
That's very interesting. Thanks, Matt. Our next question is, what is the thing that makes you the most optimistic about addressing climate change? And I know that you talked a little bit about this earlier, Dr. Barlow, so we'll ask Deanna first.
A lot of what Dr. Barlow said earlier, I think it is really helpful to kind of think about all of the ways historically that we have kind of globally come together to respond to climate change, to other issues, other huge societal issues, and been successful. So I think that, I'm optimistic that we can do it here too. I'm also optimistic that I think that there's been a real shift, obviously not, urgently enough, but a real shift in the last 10 years in accelerating our efforts around, particularly around climate resilience and adaptation. I think that this is still kind of an emerging field in the planning and policy practice world. And we've come a really long way, I think, just in the last decade. In the early 2000s, there was some talk of climate adaptation. It was mostly focused on mitigation efforts, and it was brand new pretty much then. I mean, there was a small kind of niche group of people who were really looking at this and working on this. And now it's almost ubiquitous. I mean, most cities and towns are doing some form of climate planning, some form of hazard mitigation that takes into consideration climate risks. And that's a really positive step forward. So it gives me hope that, even though right now I feel like we have stalled on implementation, we have a lot of really great planning that has been done. We have really accurate and essentially open source climate science now that is much more widespread and available than it was 10, 20 years ago. And so, that gives me hope that even though we've stalled a little bit, we'll see an acceleration of implementation efforts in the same way that we saw on the climate adaptation planning side.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The only thing I would add to my earlier comment, because I guess I have lots of ways to be optimistic, but I feel like the public discussion, especially among younger people, has a sense of urgency over the last few years that I don't feel I've heard previously. So I think the kind of public attention and the public discussion has taken on a new in the last few years. That we really need, what we really need now is action, but I do feel there's more urgency in the discussion now.
That's really great to hear. It's great to hear that we have so much to be optimistic about, especially since there's so much work that needs to be done. But unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. So we hope that everyone really enjoyed this morning's coffee break with CLF. And I really want to extend a special thanks to our two guests, but also to all of our friends and supporters for joining us. So thank you for being with us. Of course, the conversation really doesn't stop here. We encourage you to sign up for CLF's e-news by going to www.clf.org. If you sign up here, you'll be able to stay informed on all these important issues. And beyond that, you'll also be able to take action alongside your friends and community members. So my name is Tommaso Wagner, and from my home to yours, I hope you and your family stay healthy and safe. Thanks for joining us today.